Welcome back to another world history lesson. We're going to be taking a look today at the Reformation and then the Counter-Reformation that comes for that. And this is all going to be focusing on how the church in Europe, in Western Europe I should say, got divided. It split between the Catholics and the Protestants. So that's what we're going to be taking a look at. To start with, we got some key words that you should know. Things like clergy, which they are the church officials, and then there's different groups within that. We're not going to go through the church hierarchy here and things, but I should probably bring that up just as a little bit here. So on that one, you've got kind of your priests are the everyday people that are going to be preaching or working with the community there. Then above them, you have bishops who run a region. You could think of them kind of like taking over a county or maybe bigger than a county, maybe a state. And then you've got archbishops above them who are going to be like maybe doing like we could say the whole they're going to have several bishops under them, and they're going to be like the whole Midwest or something like that. You got an archbishop for that, and then above that you have the Pope, who's the leader of the whole church in Rome, kind of like the president of the United States or whatnot. And then also you have some other people in there, other high officials that are on the same page as the archbishops or cardinals, and they're the ones that elect the Pope. And then below the priests, you have other people like friars and monks and people like that do everyday church functions or do also everyday church functions. They might be living in a monastery. They might be doing some other things for the church. But so that's kind of the structure. Sorry, that's a tangent there with clergy. But clergy, again, are all those church officials. So all those people will be considered part of the clergy. Then you got corruption. Corruption is the idea of is dishonest actions by those in power. You got celibacy, which is the act of abstaining from sex. This was an expectation for all priests back in the Catholic Church. Then you got excommunication. That's where you get banned from heaven and you get kicked out of the church, and that makes you a wanted person, so you can be killed by anyone or be arrested by anyone and then killed by the church. Usually that involved being burned alive. So we'll see some examples of that here, unfortunately. Then we got indulgences, and this was a practice of buying a slip of paper that forgave sins, and this is something the Catholic Church gave out. Then you got the Pope, who's the leader of the Catholic Church in Western Europe, and he's usually seated in Rome, but at times that changed. You got protest, which means to take action of expressing disapproval of certain actions of people. And then you got reform, which is the idea of making some changes to something to improve it and make it better. And then the last one here is simony, and that's the practice of buying or selling of positions or benefits within the church. And so if I wanted to become a bishop, but I might not be qualified or might not know enough people, I might pay someone $20,000 or $50,000, $100,000 to get that position, which is an example of the corruption that we'll see here. So those are some of the key words you should know. If you didn't get all of them, make sure you pause the video here so then you can get all those things down in your notes that you need. So pause it if you need to. If you don't, we'll move on here. So to set the scene here, Europe, we've talked about it in the Middle Ages. We had a bunch of kingdoms there. And you can see those on the bottom right. And the one thing that brought all these kingdoms together here is the religion. So if we look at all of Western Europe with the Holy Roman Empire here, and then you got France and all these other regions here and Spain, you have them all connected because they're all Roman Catholics. The tan area that you see here in Russia and in Greece, that's the Eastern Orthodox Church. We might have talked about them in the Crusades. Actually, we did talk about them in the Crusades and how they split away from the Catholics. We have something called a Great Schism there. And then the orange are things other than Christians, so they might be still pagan religions and stuff like that. So you can see the one thing that brought all the Europeans together here was Christianity, even though they're all divided into different kingdoms. But that's going to change here. But the goal was to keep them all together. But the church was not doing great things. Okay, and we're going to look at a few slides here, looking at the causes of the Reformation. And so the first one is just in general the church corruption. So the priests, as we brought up as one of the terms, is celibacy. They were supposed to not have relations with anyone. They weren't supposed to get married. That was something that changed around the year 600 or so, I want to say, 500, where the Pope said priests can no longer get married, mainly because the church land was getting divided up between the priests' kids. And they didn't want to see that happening, and so they said priests can't get married anymore. As well, there was some corruption, and it doesn't look good when your priest gets divorced and stuff like that. So the church argued, the Pope argued at the time that priests need to be married to their flock or the people that they watch over. And so they had to be celibate. And so they're supposed to be celibate, but priests are having sex. The Pope is having sex. The Pope has kids. If you go to the Vatican today, you can see rooms that where kids stayed. There are famous popes during the Renaissance that had kids, and they went and did the fighting for him. This is a great example. This is Machiavelli. Wrote about this in The Prince. He was talking about one of the Pope's sons. I can't remember what his name was, but you've got that going on. Also, you have simony, which is the buying of offices, and church officials would sell offices. They wouldn't openly sell them, but people would come and bribe them and let them do that. And so what would happen is, let's say I had a kid that my eldest son that I have is going to inherit all my land and everything else. So he's going to get everything. So I don't have to worry about him going into the church. But my second son, I might want him to go to the church because I can't give him the land and he might not have anything else to do. So I'm going to talk to a bishop and pay to get him into a priesthood or pay to get him to become a bishop. Even if he's only 13 and knows not much about the Bible or anything like that, I can pay to have that happen if I got enough money. So people would do that. And then you get incompetent people in there, and that doesn't lead to good things for running the church, and as well it really kind of upsets the people that are going to church when their priest cannot read the Latin and tell people what the Bible says. So that causes major problems with people just buying it, and you get 13-year-olds as bishops. But also you have problems in that people have multiple bishops. So it'd be similar to me as a teacher teaching 3 or 4 different classes and getting paid 3 or 4 teacher salaries, but then only being in one class because I can't divide myself up between 3 or 4 classrooms. So again, someone's not there to do their job, and it's not good, but they're collecting the paycheck for it. So it's kind of shenanigans, and people get upset with that. I already kind of hit on that clergy not being well trained. Part of that is some people bought their way in. Others are just they weren't educated. They weren't getting a good education, so they couldn't do the Eucharist right or communion for those of you that are Protestant. And if they can't do it right, then the people don't feel like they're being forgiven for their sins, or they're not going to go to heaven because everything was very ritual based at this time. And so if you don't do things just right, it's going to cause problems. And so they wanted to have people that were well trained and knew what they were doing. And then last, and one of the really big ones here, is there's only supposed to be one pope. And the pope at one point left Italy and went to France to live in France because it was in better condition than Rome was. But eventually that pope, or the pope, not that pope, but later popes after a few generations of it, moved back to Rome. That upset the French, so then the French appointed their own pope to come back to France. And then to solve this, the other Catholic leaders decided, well, we'll have a third pope. So the other two will give in to him, and it'll be all great. Well, none of the 3 popes wanted to give in to each other. They're saying they're all the rightful pope, and so you have 3 popes at times, and people don't know who they're supposed to be asking for help for things or sending money to and all that stuff, and that really upset people. Eventually this gets solved, and the pope in Rome becomes the true pope again, and the others kind of disappear. But for a brief time you had 3 popes, and this really confused people and upset people and showed people that the church, although it was supposed to be perfect, was not actually perfect. Which then brings us to indulgences. Because people aren't perfect, and the church isn't perfect, people need to be forgiven for their sins to be able to reach heaven, because you cannot go to heaven if you're sinful, if you're a Christian. And so one way to help people out with this, to make them feel like they weren't going to stay in purgatory or go to hell. And purgatory, if you don't know, is the place in between heaven and hell, so you might stay some time there to pay penance for your sins that you've done. If you're Catholic, you would know about this. If you're Protestant, Protestants kind of got rid of this, and we'll talk about that. But you would pay some time there. Now, if you want to get out of that or lessen the time that you have to be there, you can buy these indulgences. These aren't around right away. They aren't around from the beginning of the church. There's something that more pops up after the Crusades, and really they pop up with the invention of the printing press, which is going to be our next thing that we talk about here. But sorry, spoiler there. But they forgave people for things, and you would pay a few coins, which a few coins doesn't sound like much, but is a lot back then, to a friar, whoever was selling them, and the church would get that money and use it for something. It could be used for the church and to help out the poor. That would be a great way to do it. But at times, or a lot of times, it got abused and was used to make new cathedrals in regions outside of where those indulgences were happening. So the most egregious example that really sets Martin Luther off here and leads to this Reformation is the selling of indulgences in Germany by a guy named Johann Tetzel, who was one of the greatest salesmen of those indulgences, and that money was going back to Rome to build St. Peter's Basilica, which is the main, the giant cathedral that is in, or basilica that is in Rome, and that's where the Pope preaches. So this really upsets people because they're like, well, why can't I just pay to get my sins forgiven? That shouldn't be how it works, or I don't have the money to pay, so it's not fair to me, while that rich person is going and giving away hundreds of dollars that they've got millions of dollars of, and it's not that big of a deal for them, and they don't change their practices. So this upsets people. And then last, this isn't really an upsetting thing at all, but the printing press makes this possible. It was invented by Gutenberg in 1440, as we've looked at here in class. And the reason why it's super important is because you can spread your ideas quicker. You can make a lot of copies of a pamphlet and send that out to everyone in the area, and there's not a way to stop it. It's very similar to I could get on Twitter and send a tweet out about something. It could be true, it could be false. But I can send a tweet out, and if I have a lot of followers, I can get a lot of people jumping on with that idea. So this can be really good in spreading really good ideas. It can be really bad in spreading bad ideas. And then depending on which side of the Reformation you're on, if you're with the Catholics or the Protestants, it's really good or really bad, just depending on what you say. And the people that are going to take advantage of this the best are they're going to be the Protestants, and really Martin Luther absolutely knocks it out of the park with how good he is at making pamphlets and getting people riled up about things. And that's why his movement succeeds, whereas some previous people tried to do it, but it didn't work out for them. And there are these people here. So the first major reformer here is a guy named John Wycliffe, and he's in England, and he questioned the authority of the Pope if the Pope was truly the most powerful man and had all the ideas, if he was perfect and all that stuff. He also argued that the Bible should be in vernacular. That's the word that I should have put on that list too. Vernacular means common language. And so what that means is that it is in English. Like this lecture I'm giving to you is in English. That's our common language here in the United States. In some areas in the United States, it might be something different. If you're in an Italian community in Chicago, you might be speaking Italian a lot. If you're in a Latino community, you might be speaking Spanish. But the vernacular is just a common tongue that people speak in a certain region. So for us, again, it's English. And John Wycliffe wanted to see things in English, and so people could then read the Bible. So he's one of the first ones to call for the Bible being in English because we should have probably brought this up earlier. The Bible is not in English. There's only two languages the Bible could be in. It could be in Latin or it could be in Greek, and most people could not read either of those. So he wanted that to happen. His ideas then get picked up by John Huss a little bit, and John Huss studied under him some in England, but then went back to Bohemia, and in Bohemia, he spread his ideas and criticized the church for its wealth and for its actions and what it was doing. And he was very successful for a while, but unfortunately, forces came down and caught him, and he was burned at the stake, which is what happens to anyone that's a heretic or gets excommunicated and thinks differently from the church. So he got burned at the stake. John Wycliffe did not get burned at the stake for what he said. He got criticized a lot during his life, but he could defend himself. But then after he died, his followers couldn't defend him as well. And so they eventually exhumed his body or dug him up from the grave and burned him alive. Well, not alive, burned him dead, but they said he was alive, and so he was excommunicated and stuff like that. So I guess even dead you can be burned at the stake for thinking differently and being excommunicated. Last major guy that we need to talk about is a guy named Desiderius Erasmus. Most people just call him Erasmus. And he attacked church corruption, but he did it in a way not trying to break away from the church in any way. He just criticized the church is doing wrong things. It shouldn't be corrupt. We can fix things on the inside, and he was hoping that would happen. Unfortunately for him, it didn't happen, and so that's when we're going to get this guy named Martin Luther. And he is the first major reformer of the church to be successful. Again, you had these earlier guys. John Huss was almost successful but got captured and killed, and his movement kind of died out in the Bohemian area after that. But it was left a hotbed. And Germany was a hotbed for this stuff as well. But Luther, who was originally going to be a lawyer, then went into the church after a lightning storm. He became a professor of Christian theology, or a doctor even. He got a doctorate in it. And after seeing the sale of indulgences going through his city of Wittenberg, he criticized that and posted something called the 95 Theses. And so he posted that to the door of the church, because the door of the church was like the bulletin board back in the day. And now me saying bulletin board is like dating myself, because I'm used to seeing things on bulletin boards. And so you might think of it like he posted onto his, well, I would say Facebook page, and that would date me again, because I don't really use Twitter and those other things, but he posted a Snapchat story about it. And now, unlike Snapchat, which can send that message out to the whole world and everyone can see it, everyone in Wittenberg could see it. And then some people decided to print those, make a copy of it and print them and send them out to the rest of Germany, and it spread that way. So not as fast communication, but really fast in comparison to what happened before. And that's going to set everything off. And so he decides that after he's forced to kind of break away from the church because they can't come back together, he gets excommunicated, but the German princes could protect him that liked him and liked the idea of challenging the church for control in their region. And so they protect him, and eventually you get this new movement called Lutheranism out of it, named after himself. I don't know if he necessarily chose that name or if that's what it got named after, because it's based on his ideas. But some of his new ideas and practices are that, one, salvation is through faith alone. You don't need to buy indulgences. You don't need to do some of the sacraments of the church and stuff like that. You just need to essentially be a halfway decent person and believe in God with all your heart. And if you do that, you're going to go to heaven. He also translated the Bible into German so that regular German people can read it. And that was a really huge thing. That is going to lead to actually some chaos in Germany because of that, because people will read it and come to their own interpretations on things, and the peasants will say things like, oh, we shouldn't be abused by princes and stuff like that, and the princes go, no, you should listen to us and do what we tell you to do, otherwise we're going to kill you. And so when the peasants revolted, sorry, this is a little bit of tangent, but the peasants revolted and they got shut down by the princes, and many got killed. And so we don't need to know that stuff, but I sometimes go into tangents, so I apologize for that. But you have that happen of it being in the Bible, and then he also, or the Bible going into German, and then he also allowed priests to get married. He said there's nothing in the Bible saying priests can't marry. It was a practice earlier in the church, and so therefore I'm going to bring it back. He got married himself to a nun that ran away from the Catholic Church, and so that's why you might see in Protestant churches today that the priest can get married. He's the one that says, that's an okay practice, and everyone else is like, yeah, that's not bad, and so they bring it back. The Catholic Church still today, if you're going to become a priest, you cannot be married. The exception to that, and there is an exception to that, would be as if you're a priest already. So if I was a pastor in a Lutheran church and then decided, you know what, Lutheranism isn't for me, I'm going to convert to Catholicism, then there's a possibility that if I went into the priesthood in Catholicism, I might be able to keep my spouse and my family and whatnot. But that's a kind of a different situation there. So we don't need to go into that too much. But that's Martin Luther and Lutheranism in a nutshell. Then we got John Calvin. John Calvin is a guy based around Switzerland. Switzerland is right kind of between France, Italy, and Germany, if you think about that today. And it was a hotbed for the Protestant Reformation as well. There was a guy before him called Zwingli. I can't remember what his first name was. Sorry. But he kind of started the Protestant movement, or was a major figure in that. But he'll die defending Switzerland against invaders from Catholic lands that are trying to force them to go back to Catholicism. And so after his death, or before his death, John Calvin was brought in to speak and be a major player there because of his ideas. And after Zwingli dies, John Calvin becomes the main man in Switzerland, leading the new Protestant Reformation there. And so some of his major beliefs that he pushes is this idea of predestination, and this is that your actions and the possibility of going to heaven have already been determined by God. God already knows whether you're going to heaven or hell. He knows what actions you're going to do. There is no surprises to God. It is, everything's already done. It's already been seen, and so therefore you don't really have a choice in what you do. You're just going forward in life, and everything's already been done and decided. So that brings in, we haven't talked about this thing in Christianity, but there's a big thing called free will, whether you have free will. We're not going to get into a debate about that kind of stuff here, but this leads to conflicts over that, because if everything's predestined, then you don't really have free will. But this is what he believed. He pulled ideas from the Bible on that, and this is the major kind of thing he does or pushes for in his church. And he also pushes, again, faith alone. He doesn't say that you can do indulgences and other things like that. These new beliefs that he comes up with and that he designs will lead to the creation of the Presbyterian Church, and this will also lead to other church known as the Anabaptists, or denominations known as the Anabaptists, and they become the Baptists. So if you're part of a Baptist church today, you're starting kind of developed with John Calvin and what was going on in Switzerland. If you're part of a Lutheran church today, you were part of the church that broke off with Martin Luther. Last major guy we're going to talk about here is a guy named Henry VIII. He was the King of England. He was originally a major supporter of the Catholics during the Reformation and criticized Luther and others that were breaking away. But an unfortunate thing happened in his life, in that his wife could not give him a son. And without a son, the monarchy would fall, or his family running the monarchy would fall. And so he said that he wanted to get a divorce to the Pope. And getting a divorce in Catholicism is a no-no. You're not allowed to do that. And so he tried to, but he couldn't. And so he said, well, I'm going to break off and make my own church then. All these other people are doing this. So he broke away and made his own church. And it's called the Church of England, or the Anglican Church. If you're living here in the States, it is called the Episcopalian Church, because when we broke away from England, we didn't want it to be called the Anglican Church anymore, because we weren't going to be fully loyal to them, because we just broke away from them. And so we call it the Episcopalian Church here. And his new beliefs are that you can get a divorce, and that the king is the head of the church instead of the Pope. But other than that, and if it's queen like Queen Elizabeth II right now, she is the head of the church. Or if you had Queen Elizabeth I, you saw that she brought this back, which we'll get to. But she was the head of the church. So they're the head of the church. You can get a divorce. But really, a lot of the basic principles of Catholicism didn't disappear. They're still there in the Church of England. Then the last but he eventually dies. His son takes over, and then he dies young. And then his daughter takes over, his eldest daughter, and she gets known as Bloody Mary because she's Catholic, and she tries to kill all the Protestants. Well, she dies of cancer, and Queen Elizabeth, the second daughter that Henry had, comes in and takes over and brings back Catholicism and establishes it, and firmly establishes the Anglican Church as the Church of England. And so that's why it's still the case today. And then if you look at the map there, you can see also what's going on in other areas. So in Ireland, they stay very Catholic. This is what leads to, other than in Northern Ireland, and that's what leads to the issues of the Irish independence movements, or the separation that led to the Northern Ireland. Some people in Northern Ireland wanted to break away, and so it led to a lot of fighting in there and bloody violence. We probably won't get to take a look at that at all this year, but that's a major event if you want to know some Irish history there. Scotland becomes a Calvinist area. They become Presbyterian and whatnot. They get influenced by that, and so they break away. So the whole United Kingdom is kind of divided on whether they're Catholic or Protestant, or in this case Anglican as well, with which is a branch of Protestantism in England. Okay, and so this is what a map of what everything kind of looks like in the end. So you see mainly Spain and Portugal and France and Italy stay Catholic, and they're still very heavily Catholic. In other areas, you start to see a mix of things. In Switzerland, you see a mix of Catholics and Calvinists. In France, you see some Calvinists in there as well. In England, you see them become Anglican. Oh, and also Ireland stays very Catholic. Sorry, forgot about them. Scotland is going to be very Protestant. Germany over here in the Holy Roman Empire is very divided. They're divided between Lutherans and Catholics. And then the Scandinavian countries all will become Protestant. So Norway, Sweden, Denmark, and Finland later, when it becomes its own country, are all heavily Lutheran. In the East, you see it becomes a mix of Lutherans, Roman Catholics, and also mixed in there are going to be Eastern Orthodox Christians. So you have kind of all that stuff going on. But this is kind of what Europe looks like at the end of the Reformation. This is kind of where things end up at. And if you go through Europe today, you're still going to see a lot of these basic trends. Italy is still very Catholic, Spain is still very Catholic, Portugal is still very Catholic, England is still Anglican, and all that kind of stuff. Last things to talk about here. Two things. Sorry, forgot about. We got the Counter-Reformation there. But the effects of this initial Reformation of Calvin, Luther, and Henry VIII are you get wars. Europe is now divided. We've already kind of talked about this, and so you're going to get wars out of this. People are going to fight to show that their truth or their religion is the truth. So you got in France, you get these groups known as the Huguenots, who fight 8 civil wars in France. And they finally get to be able to practice their own Protestant faith with the Edict of Nantes. And they're allowed to do that. That'll eventually get revoked later on. We won't get into that. But they get freedom of religion there. And this is going to be a kind of a theme that you see freedom of religion happening. You're going to get, in Germany, some initial divisions. And then you'll get something called the Peace of Augsburg. That's not on here. I'm going a little bit overboard on things. But you get the Peace of Augsburg. And that allows German princes to practice whatever religion they want, which then forces the people in their area to practice what the prince does. And the Holy Roman Emperor will not like that, and he will decide to fight his princes to take back the right and force them to convert back to Catholicism. And so that's going to lead to something called the 30 Years' War, where all of Europe will go and fight in Germany, and somewhere between 3 and 11.5 million people will die in Germany from all this. And eventually the end result is something known as the Treaty of Westphalia, where we go back to where we were before the whole war started, and that the princes of Germany are allowed to choose who gets to believe what in their kingdoms, and they have freedom to choose that. The Holy Roman Emperor can say Catholicism is the best, but they can't force those princes to come to terms with that. Some other conflicts that happen are we already brought up Switzerland has fighting with Catholics trying to invade them to make them go back to Catholicism. And also England is threatened to be invaded by the Spanish to convert back to Catholicism. But Queen Elizabeth I is able to defend England against that invasion when she defeats the Spanish Armada, or she sends her navy, or much smaller navy, to defeat something known as the Spanish Armada, which had hundreds of ships in it, and they are able to stay Protestant. So lots of wars happen because of this, because people want to show that their religion is right, or their version of it is right, and so they fight a lot. Which then leads us to the last thing. The Catholic Church realizes, okay, wait, we actually have to do stuff. People are running away. We need to fix things. And so there's something known as the Counter-Reformation. And that's where they fix things that the Reformation pointed out as issues. So they limited corruption. They censored books that had different ideas. So anything that was a Lutheran idea, they censored and made sure it didn't make its way into Catholic territories. They made sure that the priests got a better education, so they knew what the heck was going on in the Bible, so they could preach things correctly. They established something known as the Jesuit order, which was a goal to bring people that converted back to Catholicism by going out and educating them. But instead, that didn't happen. That didn't work. But they are going to be used to convert people around the world, especially in the New World when they start setting up those American colonies. And then the last thing, and the big thing they really do to control things, is they set up inquisitions. They also limit the sale of indulgences. I should probably put that. That kind of goes with limiting corruption. But they do. You can't really buy an indulgence anymore from the Catholic Church, although they still say they have the right to. I believe they still say they have the right to do that if they wanted to. But they haven't done any sales of indulgences anytime lately. Okay, and then the last thing, their inquisitions. You have an inquisition is where they would lock down an area and make sure that there wasn't anyone that wasn't Catholic or whatever. And so in Spain, you can see this the best. So it's what's known as the Spanish Inquisition, and they kicked out anyone that wasn't Catholic. So if you're a Jewish, Muslim, or Protestant in any way, you got kicked out, or you would be possibly killed for it. They also had a lot of witchcraft things going on because people suspected their neighbors of crazy things, and so you have a lot of accusations of witchcraft and terrible things going on there with that. And so you have that going on. And then if anyone was caught or put on trial and found guilty of any of those things, they would be put to death or imprisoned for very long amounts of time. Galileo is a great example of this. Now, he wasn't part of the Spanish Inquisition. This was part of the Inquisition in Italy. But he published books that said that the earth was not the center of the universe, and it was the sun instead. And he argued for that on findings that other people found and based on observations that he had with his telescope that he made. And the church said, no, you got to take back what you've said because you're wrong. And he says, no, this is how it is. And the church goes, well, if you don't take back what you say, we're going to kill you. And he went, okay, I'll tamp down my things. And so then he took it back. Didn't really believe that he took it back, but took it back so that he didn't die. And then he was placed under house arrest the rest of his life. And so he just did experiments in his home. But yeah, that's kind of the Reformation in a nutshell. It's kind of a chaotic time in that they go and try to change issues in the church, and it leads to a mass fracturing. And today, if you look at all the different branches of the church, you've got where we had two before, Roman Catholic and Eastern Orthodox, you now have hundreds of different branches of churches that you can go and be a part of. So that's, again, Reformation in a nutshell. Thank you, guys.